Hotaro is seemingly an average high schooler who has just entered high school, but from his perspective, the entire world looks gray. He's a nihilist and believes in his motto that if there is anything that is not necessary to be done, he won't do it, and if there is something that is necessary to be done, he will do it as quickly and efficiently as possible. He lives in modern-day Japan with his family, and is a complete loner who hates having a life. It sounds pretty much like you, doesn't it? Today is the first day of school, and he has made up his mind that he will spend all of these years alone, spending as little energy as possible, without getting into any pointless endeavors that at the end of the day provide no results. He walks inside the campus and is immediately put off by all the high-energy students welcoming the newcomers and trying to coax them into joining their clubs. He walks straight through them, puts his shoes in the locker, and moves to his class where he meets up with Satoshi, who is his best and only friend and has known him for almost all his life, being familiar with his quirks and his philosophy of making as little effort to achieve anything as possible. He hypes him up for the new day of school, as it brings endless possibilities, but Hotaro refuses to show even a little enthusiasm. He asks him why he is still in school anyway, as he is the kind of guy who immediately walks back home as soon as school is over. But Hotaro hands him a letter with a sigh. Satoshi opens the letter, which is from Hotaro's sister, who is in India for the time being. She wrote a letter to him which arrived yesterday, begging him to join the Classic Literature Club, as no one usually does. According to her, every single year, the number of students wanting to join the club decreases, and she is afraid that it will be shut down before long. She claims to have a special connection with the literature club and tells him to join it to prevent it from dying. Hotaro harbors a lot of love for his sister and ends up agreeing to her requests. Takeshi assures him that he won't encounter any difficulties because there are no other members of the literature club, so if he joins, he'll have a whole classroom to himself. This actually makes Hotaro a little bit happy, as at least he won't have to spend his energy to talk to someone else, and he bids Satoshi goodbye before going to the staff room to get the key. He arrives at the classroom allotted to the literature club and is thankful for the fact that it is in a very remote location inside of the school. He puts the key inside of the lock and opens it up. Once he enters the room, he is surprised to see a short black-haired girl watching outside of the window. She turns around and walks up to Hotaro, introducing herself as Iru. She claims that she already knows Hotaro as they were in the orientation together, which shocks Hotaro as there were a bunch of kids there and he didn't even notice Iru was there. She tells him that she has joined the club for some personal reasons and asks if Hotaro has also joined the club. He, however, quickly refuses, saying that he hasn't, as now that the club has a member, it will live on and he won't have to join any clubs. He turns around and starts walking before telling her to lock the doors when she leaves. She, however, tells him that she cannot lock the door. He asks her why she can't, to which she replies that she doesn't have the keys. Hotaro looks at her confused and produces the keys from his pocket, handing it over to her. He asks her that if she didn't have the keys, how did she lock herself in? She looks at him confused and asks whether the door was locked. Hotaro realizes that she had no idea she was locked, and this makes the girl curious, as she wants to solve the mystery of how the door can be locked when she doesn't have the keys. Satoshi also enters the class as he comes to check on Hotaro and eagerly gets intertwined with the mystery. Hotaro tries to leave again, but the girl grabs his hands and asks him to please help her solve this mystery. That moment hooked Hotaro, who has never felt anything like this before. He ends up obliging and asks her whether she saw anything amiss. She replies that sometime before she came in, she heard a clinking sound, and when they all focused their ears, they even heard clinking noises. They go out and spot the janitor, who is closing up all the rooms that were unoccupied because he has the master key. They all realize that the janitor must have thought that the room was empty because of its remote location, and shut it up, without Iru noticing that she had been locked from the inside. Iru is satisfied that she was able to know the truth, and they all walk near their lockers. She asks Satoshi whether he would like to join, and even though he has multiple clubs, he agrees to join. Hotaro tries to tell them that he isn't joining, but Iru again grabs his hands and asks him to join. Hotaro again melts at her touch and ends up giving her his application card, making her an official member of the literature club. The next day, Hotaro comes to school and after the day is over is forced to stay back and write an essay that they got for homework. Satoshi makes fun of him for not completing his homework on time, but he replies that he simply forgot to bring the homework to school. Satoshi laughs at it and starts telling him about a new mystery inside of the school. According to him, in the morning, a girl was coming up from the grounds while it was raining outside. She heard the beautiful melody of classical music playing in the music room, but it was entirely dark. She gets intrigued by it and opens the door, but is horrified to see that the piano is empty, and the room seems to be empty. The melody is still playing, however, and her heart starts beating faster as the piece starts coming to an end. As soon as the piece ends, she feels a chill run down her spine and a scraping noise. Suddenly from the floor, a figure appeared, whose hair are all messy and has bloodshot eyes. She staggers to stand and starts walking towards the girl, by which time she shuts the door and runs away as fast as possible. He finishes the story and looks at Hotaru excitedly, but his gaze is met by the same unenthusiastic face as he starts writing away at the piece of paper once again. Suddenly, however, he asks Satoshi whether this news has rotated around the school, and when he says it is a pretty big deal, he immediately feels like Iru will soon come over to him and ask him to help him figure out the mystery. He immediately takes out a piece of paper and starts scribbling something before telling Satoshi to tell her a make-believe story about the mystery of the secret clubhouse. Iru arrives perfectly on cue, enters the room, and walks straight over to their desk, asking whether they have heard about the music room mystery. Hotaru, however, quickly cuts her off and tells her that Satoshi was telling him about a very famous mystery at the school. She immediately gets hooked, and Satoshi makes up a story about a secret club known as the Spider Club. This is a ghost club in which no one knows who the member is or how they are selected. It is said that they always put their notice on the notice board, but only a select few people are able to find it every year. This immediately intrigued her, and she asked whether they would help her find it. Hotaru finishes his essay at that very moment and tells her that yes, he will. They all go to the notice board on their floor and rummage through it, but are unable to find anything of substance. Finally, Hotaru advises that maybe they should go down to the main notice board, which all of them agree is a good idea. They make their way to the ground floor and are awed to see the notice board filled with so many posters from all of the numerous clubs around the school. The notice board looks like a war zone, as all the clubs want to portray their clubs on the main board so that they catch more eyes. They start looking closely at the board and see through almost every poster, but start losing hope when suddenly, Hotaru draws their attention and informs them that he found it below one of the posters. He shows her the small notice for the Spider Club, but she doesn't seem to be very impressed by this. She tells him that she gets the feeling that this mystery wasn't a mystery to begin with, as there are many loopholes in it. They, however, realize that it is getting late and decide to part ways. Satoshi and Hotaru start walking back together when Satoshi asks him why he crafted the lie and created the poster for the Spider Club, and then he puts it below the other notice while no one is looking. He looks at him and tells him that he simply didn't want to go to the music room as it was on the farther side of the hall and not on his way to move outside the school. Satoshi looks at him in awe and starts laughing before asking whether he has any idea about the mystery of the music room. Hotaru looks at him and says that the music room is almost always occupied by really passionate students who have given their entire lives to music. The pianist especially has a habit of sleeping inside the room, as she doesn't want to waste time, so she closed the windows in the rooms and slept while playing a CD of classical music on the tape recorder, which acted as an alarm, as when the music gets over, she will realize it and wake up. That is why when the student opened the room, she saw no one at the piano, but heard the music playing, and as soon as the music stopped, she woke up groggy with bloodshot eyes because of the low amount of rest, which scared the living daylights out of the poor student, and she ran away. Satoshi looks at him in awe and tells him that his energy-conserving ways will be put to the test because of Iru, as she seems to be the only one who can force him to work. They then split up to go back to their homes to get some well-deserved rest. A month has passed since the last incident, and Hotaru seems to have gotten used to this new routine. Most of the time, he doesn't mind it at all, because he only has to go there after classes for a bit and sit and read a book, which he doesn't really mind anyway. He likes it best when Iru doesn't talk to him and simply reads her book, but she has developed a cute habit, where she offers her some of her homemade sweets every time he sits down to read. One fine day, while reading the book in the after hours and enjoying his tea, Iru suddenly stands up, saying that this is not how a club is supposed to be. Hotaru looks at her and tells her to sit down and not waste energy on useless things. She, however, complains about how their club is monotonous, and they never do anything for fun. Hotaru looks at her and tells her that their club is supposed to be a literature club and not some sports club, where they need to perform activities. She, however, is adamant and tells him that they should start preparing for the upcoming school festival. Hotaru tells her that he has no interest in doing anything for the school festival whatsoever. Iru tells him that she won't hear anything about not doing anything for the school festival. He looks at her exhausted and tells her that they will also open some dumb stalls like any other club, but she refuses him. She tells him that the literature club has had a very rich history, and every single year people from the club have created an anthology for the festival, and they should do the same. Hotaru outright refuses to have anything to do with that and tells her that he doesn't want to spend so much energy on anything and would rather do something low effort. She keeps pestering him to the point of asking whether Hotaru thinks that creating an anthology would be less work than dealing with her every day pestering him about creating an anthology, so he agrees to her demand. He asks her whether she has any idea about how this thing has to be created, to which she replies that she doesn't. He asks her how she will do this if she has no idea how the anthology has to be written, but she replies that they will just find the previous year's copies and then learn how to write it. Hotaru is again frustrated because of the work she's making him do, but he can't say anything because of how dedicated she seems, so they both start searching through the entire room for the copies of the previous year's anthologies. They are unable to find the anthologies in the room, so Hotaru sits down on his desk, but she tells him that they are not done yet and drags him out to the library, as she believes the library will have the copies for sure. In the library, they see a short-haired girl sitting behind the counter named Ebara, who seems to know Hotaru and makes a face when he comes inside. She tells him that if he is up to no good, he isn't welcome here, but he retorts with a wisecrack of his own, pissing her off. At the very moment, however, Satoshi appears inside the library and Ebara's temperament immediately changes. Iru seems confused at this sudden change, but Hotaru says that Ebara used to like Satoshi during their middle school days when they studied together. Satoshi is a guy with maxed out riz and can make anyone's water break just by speaking to them in his charming voice. He asks Hotaru what he is up to, and he replies that this is more of a hostage situation as this absolute numbskull Iru has forcefully retracted him from his seat, where he had happily glued his ass so that he doesn't have to move. Satoshi laughs at this and goes on to introduce both Iru and Ebara to each other, and Iru gets straight to the point, asking her whether she has seen the previous year's anthology from the literature club. Ebara looks at Hotaru and smirks, asking how the hell did a loser like him actually join a club, but like a true Sigma, he tells her to shut her trap. She turns towards Iru and replies that she doesn't have any idea about the anthologies as she hasn't seen them around in the library, but believes that they might be kept in the stack. Iru asks her whether they can see the stack, but she tells her that only the librarian can let them have a look at that. Hotaru has had enough of these thoughts talking to each other, and like an absolute Chad, he simply starts walking outside the door. He is, however, stopped by Iru, who has vowed to herself that she will make this poor man's life hell. She tells him that they are going to wait for the librarian, and while they were arguing about that, Satoshi chimed in between, asking Ebara to recount the mystery that she was talking about earlier. Hotaru thinks to himself that he is never going to see the end of it if Ebara tells a mystery, which makes Iru curious, but Ebara starts the story. She tells them that for some time now she's been noticing a mysterious pattern in a book. She explains that she stays over in the library every Friday, and for some reason, every Friday a book is borrowed from the library during the lunch break and is then returned by the end of the day. This is very confusing because when you borrow a book, you can keep it for a week before returning it to the library, but for some reason, the person who borrows it always returns it the very same day. Iru asks her excitedly whether she can have a look at the book, and Ebara takes out the book for her, which is a really beautiful hardcover leather-bound book about the history of the school. Iru comments that the book looks pretty, and everyone agrees. Hotaru, meanwhile, is trying to ignore all of this and decides to keep reading his book as he just wants to get the anthologies and go back home. Iru, however, is not going to let the lad have his leisure time and keeps putting the book in front of his eyes, while Hotaru looks at her like he wants to slap her. He looks at it and says that maybe it isn't such a big deal, and that some students want to have a look at it during his free time. Ebara, however, tells him to have a look at the people who are borrowing the book. It turns out that every single time there's a different person borrowing the book. This is perplexing because why would different people borrow the same book every single week and follow the same pattern of borrowing it during their lunch break and returning it by the end of the day? This is indeed very intriguing, and even Hotaru seems very confused. He, however, doesn't want to spend any energy on such things and tries to weasel his way out of it, but Iru continuously pesters him by putting the book in front of him. Ebara finally tells them to settle down and not make much noise in the library, and they shut up immediately. He looks at Iru hopefully, thinking that she will back off, but she isn't backing off and seems to be really headstrong in making him help her solve this case. Hotaru finally ends up conceding, realizing that he will not be able to shake her off and that it would be an inefficient use of energy. Her eyes light up as she gets really excited about it. He sits down and finally starts racking his brain on it, and he tells them that this book is definitely not being used for literary purposes, as no one could read a history book that big during that time. He states that the book is being used for ulterior purposes and asks everyone if they have any bright ideas. Ebara says that the books, if stacked up just right, can be used as pillows. Satoshi claims that if you attach this book to your arm, it can be used as a shield. Hotaru looks at them with contempt, but big brain Iru tells them to stop joking around, as obviously that is not what the books will be used for. Hotaru turns towards her in anticipation, hoping for a good idea, but alas, this guy is surrounded by a bunch of people who have the collective IQ of a brick wall. She replies that the best use for a book like this would be to use it as a pickle preserver, and Hotaru has enough and tells them to shut their trap so that he can think. He thinks hard but is unable to get any clues as to what the book might be used for if not for reading. He starts placing some clues together, the first one being that everyone who borrowed the book was a girl and all of them belonged to Class 2. He proposes that it might be a signal of yes or no. For example, if the book is kept upright, it's a yes, and if it is inverted, then it is a no. Ibara, however, tells them that this should not be the case and takes them to the place where she keeps everyone's books, and all of them are kept randomly. Now Hotaru is out of answers, and Ibara makes fun of him for not being able to think of anything, but suddenly, the weird-ass Iru starts smelling the book like a total biatch, and Ibara gets scared of her weird antics, backing off when suddenly Iru says that the book smells of paint. Ibara tries to smell it, but she says that she can't smell anything. Hotaru, however, suddenly has a bright idea and tells Iru to go and check on something for her, however, forces him to come along as well, which again annoys the crap out of him. But he has no energy to argue anymore and simply goes alongside her. He leads them all to the art class and comments that there's only one class that happens on Friday in which girls from different sections come together, and that is the optional art class. He believes that every single girl that borrowed the book took it to the art class, but the rest are still confused as to what the book was used for, but Hotaru tells them that they will see themselves soon and enters the art room. As soon as they get inside the class, they are surprised to see that almost all of the paintings that are being painted currently are of a girl with a book. Hotaru explains that the book has a beautiful leather-bound vintage cover and is the perfect color to be used as a motif for an art piece. And because none of the students want to carry such a huge book alongside them, they would rather simply borrow it every Friday and return it that very day. Both Ibara and Iru are highly impressed by the mad rise that Hotaru possesses and probably want him to have their children. When they return back to the library, they all start chatting while Hotaru watches from the side, thinking that this is not what he planned to do during high school, as he is not here to make friends and memories. He just wants to do the minimum amount of work possible and hence starts leaving, but Iru again grabs him and tells him that they still need to wait for the librarian as they need the anthology. Finally, the librarian comes and Satoshi introduces himself and the others, while asking whether she has seen the anthology that has been created by the literature club, but she replies that the back issues are sadly not in the stacks and they will have to find it somewhere else. Iru gets sad after hearing this, but Satoshi, as lively as ever, tells her that they will find it soon, and for the day, they all go back to their home. The next day, early in the morning, Hotaru gets a call and has to wake up on a Sunday. The caller turns out to be Iru, and he asks her what the hell was so urgent that it couldn't have waited till the next day, but Iru simply apologizes and tells him that she wants to meet him today. Hotaru tries to avoid this, but she starts pleading with him, and he is unable to say no to her. Later in the afternoon, Hotaru goes inside a cafe and waits for Iru while sipping on his coffee as she is late. Finally, she arrives in a pretty dress and sits down with him, while idly swirling the cream in his cup. Hotaru looks at her and asks her what she wants to talk about, and she starts trying to dance around the point, which annoys him. And he simply gets up and tells her that he will leave if she doesn't speak soon, but she quickly stops him and tells him she is nervous. He asks her what she's nervous about, which makes her shyly look at him, and she replies that she wants to confess something. Hotaru gets so surprised that his mind goes blank and he simply stays quiet and listens to her, his heart beating loudly, thinking that this is a love confession. Iru kept beating around the bush until finally she blurted out that she wanted his help to solve a mystery of hers. Hotaru looks at her blankly as the truth slowly settles in that he has been epically pranked by God, and she just wants her help with another mystery. She tells him that she had an uncle known as Siki, who used to study at their school 45 years ago, and even he was the president of the Classic Literature Club. 7 years ago, her uncle went to India for a trip, but then all contact from him ceased as he was deemed missing. There were several investigations, but no clue of him was ever found. She tells him that she and her uncle used to be very close when she was young, and he always used to spend time with her. Wow, creepy. Still, however, she has very fond memories of him as he was a good person, and she used to take him to parks to play. He was also a highly intelligent individual who had answers to everything. According to her, she could ask him anything, and he would always answer her, quenching her curiosity and giving her more knowledge about the world. She tells Hotaru that in a way he also resembles his uncle, which is very kinky, but her reasons are that he, just like her uncle, is able to solve every single mystery that comes his way and has an answer for almost everything. She then gets to the point. She reveals that one fine day she was playing in her house when she asked her uncle a question, but this time, instead of a solid answer with a hearty laugh, she remembered hearing something really tense and sad so much so that she started bawling her eyes out and crying nonstop. What was surprising was that even her uncle seemed so upset by it that he didn't even try to console her but sat there, motionless. Eventually, her mom came and took her back to her room, where she finally ended up sleeping after getting exhausted from all the crying. Hotaru listens to her solemnly, and she tells him that the thing is she doesn't remember what her uncle told her or what the question was that she asked him. According to her, the entire ordeal was so disturbing for her young mind that she ended up blocking it completely out of her memories and has no recollection of it. She looks at Hotaru and starts pleading with him to help her, but before she could even complete her sentence, he refused. Hotaru realizes that this is a very important part of her childhood, and there is a very good chance of her entire outlook on life being changed if she remembers exactly what her uncle said. He doesn't want to take on the responsibility of someone, especially when this can change their entire personality. He tells her that she can ask around herself and that she has more friends who she can recruit to help her. She looks at him with eyes filled with sorrow and replies that she did try to find out about it herself. She went through the staff room asking every teacher about her uncle, but sadly, none of them had been in the school long enough to know him. She also adds that she is not a person who would go on to blabber about her past to anyone she meets, as she is very sensitive about it and doesn't want people to know. She'd only ask him because she thinks that he is very much like his uncle and can think like him. He tells her that she has 3 years to go in this high school, which is enough time to remember something like this on her own, but she replies that she wants to remember what her uncle said before his funeral. There has been no news of her uncle for the past 7 years, and now he's being proposed dead, and his funeral will be held soon. She wants to remember what he told her when she says her final goodbye to him. She then starts looking down to try and control her tears. Hotaru looks at her and feels like she's just a small girl who is looking aimlessly in the sand to find a toy she lost. He finally tells her that he will help her but will not claim any responsibility for her mental health. She looks at him with sparkling eyes and tells him that she is fine with it and thanks him. Days have passed since that incident and the time for midterm examinations has come. During the midterm examinations, all of the club activities cease so that the students can focus on their exams. Naturally, the literature club has also been closed for the time being, which means that Hotaru hardly sees Iru and usually spends his time with only Satoshi, who is in his class itself. His days go by with him simply studying for exams, going to school, and then again studying for exams until the final subject examinations are also done. He comes back home and lays down on his bed, finally relaxed now that the examinations are over. He looks over idly at his study table and spots a letter from her sister. He opens it and reads the content, which states that she is in Istanbul right now, not in the city but inside of the Japanese embassy because something went wrong with her passport. She asks about Hotaru in the letter, whether he's enjoying the literature club, and whether there are any other members apart from himself in the club. She also states that the school festival must be coming soon and he should create an anthology for it, as has been the tradition of the literature club ever since its establishment. She also tells him a very important piece of information in the very next line, which solved a lot of the problems related to creating an anthology. She tells him that the previous year's anthology copies cannot be found in the library or even in the stacks. They are all kept inside a chemical locking safe, which was inside the club room. She also adds that it is not locked, so they can simply open it and find it. Hotaru is relieved about this, as now they won't have to go looking all over the place for the previous year's anthologies. The next day, they all meet inside the club room, and by the way, apparently Ibara is also a member of the literature club now. Hotaru will be getting hella girls. He informs them about the letter and shows it to them, and even they are happy. But then they look around and find out that there is no goddamn locking safe in their club room. They all start thinking about what could have happened, but Hotaru calmly tells them to chill out, as this is just because every time a new session starts, the classrooms in which the clubs are held get changed. They quickly get up and decide to head over to the staff room to ask around about the previous year's classrooms in which clubs were held, but Hotaru stops them and tells them that he has already asked around, and last year the biology lab was used as the literature club's base of operations. Both of the girls look impressed by his quick work, and they both start moving out of the room to see the biology lab, and Hotaru happily sits down reading his book, thinking that they have finally forgotten about him, when of course Iru comes back and drags him with them. Hotaru leads the way, but when he comes near the biology room, he notices 2 small boxes attached to either side of the hallways, drawing his suspicion. Both of the girls haven't seemed to notice this thing as they walk ahead, knocking at the door and calling out. One of them tries the door but realizes that it is closed, so they wait outside when suddenly a long-haired senior walks outside of the door, smiling at them uneasily and trying to cover the open door with his body. He tells them that the lab is currently occupied by the newspaper club, but he is alone here today because none of the other members showed up. Hotaru notices that there is a very strong smell of room freshener coming off from his body as he asks the girls why they are here. Eru replies that she is the president of the literature club and wanted to get the locking safe from the room, which has their anthologies. The senior seems to jump at the mention of a locker and tells them that he hasn't seen any such locker inside the room. They tell him that it must be inside somewhere as this room was occupied by the literature club last year, but the senior again firmly tells them that the locker isn't inside, and at this point, Hotaru decides that they should leave and bids the senior farewell while starting to move back, but both Ibara and Iru persist, asking the senior to have a look inside, as otherwise they will have to search the entire school for the back issues. As soon as Hotaru hears about having to search the entire school for the books, he comes back, as there is no way in hell he is going to go through that much trouble and expend that much energy, so he stays. Ibara gets into the senior's face and tells him that technically speaking, this is still a classroom, and they are allowed to have a look inside it if they want. The senior thinks for a while, then slyly tells them that they can have a look inside, but they have to make it quick and not take anything apart while he is working. He opens the door and they all pour inside of the room. The first thing that Hotaru notices is that the table is littered with papers, and there is a radio device on the table as well. The window was open and the fan was also blowing towards the window. The senior looks very uncomfortable while the rest have a look around the area. Finally, Iru comes back saying that she couldn't find the safe and that it might not be here, which seems to bring some relief for the senior. But Hotaru stops her and asks the senior whether they displaced any of the stuff anywhere, to which he replies that they did move a bunch of cardboard boxes here and there. Hotaru quickly tells him that they will have to search the entire room as there is so much mess that they don't really know where things might be hidden. The senior immediately becomes very agitated and tells him that he doesn't have enough time for all this crap, but Hotaru immediately tells him that he won't have to do anything, but he starts sweating and tells him that he doesn't want his things to be messed with as he is really busy. Hotaru tells him that they will put everything back where they found it, but the senior gets even more agitated and tells him to shut up and get out of his club room with heavy breathing. The girls seem to be a little scared, but Hotaru stands there defiantly and tells him that if he wants it this way, then he will leave and have one of the staff members search the entire room from top to bottom for their books. This scares the living crap out of the senior, and he immediately starts sweating and shaking in anger and fear. He looks straight into the senior's eyes and tells him that he has an errand to run in the library and will come back soon. He tells the senior that he has no interest in anything else apart from the anthologies, and if he finds them while he is gone, he should leave them in the literature club's classroom. The senior seems to be seething with rage, but he gulps down his anger and tells him that if he finds it, he will let them know. He goes outside, takes the girls with him, and tells them to wait with him outside the library for a bit. After a while, they go back to their club room, and to their surprise, the back issues of the anthology are already neatly stacked on their table. Ibara and Iru start going through the volumes one by one when Ibara looks at Hotaru and asks him how he knew that the senior had the books. He takes her into a corner and tells her that what he's going to tell her is to be kept a secret. He then tells her that he noticed the infrared sensors on the hallway, which the senior had put up, and was immediately suspicious of something. When he opened the door, he was trying to hide something as he was wearing very strong cologne that had been freshly applied. Moreover, when you have a look inside, he had the windows open and the fan running, which was pointed towards the window, even though there were a bunch of papers lying down that could very easily fly outside because of the fan. So why would he do it? It suddenly dawns on Ibara and she says cigarettes. Hotaru nods, saying that the senior was smoking inside the room and has a radio device that alerts him as soon as someone crosses the hallway to walk near his room. He's from a very prestigious family, so if he were found smoking on the school premises, it would be a very serious breach of rules, and he can't take any chances with bringing shame upon the name of his family. Hotaru claims that the senior must have kept the cigarettes and the lighter inside of the locking safe itself and hid them so no one could find them, and that is why he wasn't willing to show them the location of the case. Ibara looks at him with awe, as she never guessed he was this perceptive, but they are interrupted by the guy with maxed out Riz, Satoshi, who enters the room dressed as a frickin' sunflower. Ibara informs him about the back issues that they have found and shows them, while Hotaru switches his attention over to Iru, who is very seriously looking at one of the issues. She looks at him, takes him off to one side, and shows him the issue, which was named Hyuka. She tells him that this was the thing that she asked about with his uncle, which was when he said something that made her cry. She hands the issue over to him, saying that the issue contains the name of her uncle a couple of times. She tells him that something happened 45 years ago in the literature club, and Hotaru starts reading what the issue said. It stated that it has been a year since Siki left the high school, not only as a hero, but as a legend and a true inspiration to them all, as he sacrificed everything for the greater good and will always be remembered in the history of the school. She grabs her head, saying that she is so close to knowing what he said, but it just won't come in her mind. Hotaru looks at the issue number of this anthology, and it turns out to be the second issue, so he turns towards Ibara to find the first issue, but she looks shocked at him and says that issue number 1 is missing from the stack. Eru seems to be sad that issue number 1 is missing, but they decide to head back for the day, and on their way back, Hotaru asks Eru why she does not enlist the help of both Satoshi and Ibara. She replies that she doesn't want a lot of people to know, but then Hotaru asks whether she considers them her friends, and Eru immediately stops in the middle and tells him that she will reveal her problem to them tomorrow. The next day, she explains everything to both Satoshi and Ibara, and both of them are highly supportive, making the club's primary objective to figure out what happened 45 years ago. On the next Sunday, they all decide to go over to Eru's residence with a bunch of theories and hypotheses about what could have happened 45 years ago. Hotaru, as unenergetic as usual, waits around for Satoshi to come, and suddenly he hears the eccentric voice of Satoshi coming from afar, cycling towards him. He almost runs into Hotaru, who is having second thoughts about his sexuality, but tells Satoshi that he doesn't swing that way and is as straight as a pretzel. They both start cycling towards the countryside, away from the bustle of the city, and Hotaru asks Satoshi whether he likes his life being in high school, always being so energetic and happy. Satoshi slows down and tells him that of course he has his fair share of problems, but he likes to be as rosy as possible and tries to find happiness in every situation. Hotaru reflects on himself and how he is the stark opposite of Satoshi in this regard. He lives his life in shades of gray. Not that kind, you dipshits. He just likes his life to be very monotonous and doesn't like interacting with people much. After biking for quite a while, they reach Iru's residence, which is huge to say the least. The house is big enough to contain my insecurities, but not big enough to contain my love for you beautiful idiots who are subscribed to the channel. They enter the house, hoping that a cute maid would usher them in, but instead they find Eru, who escorts them inside. They pass through a bunch of rooms that seem to be very ancient and preserved in time. They reach the room where Ibara is already sitting on the ground by the table. Floor gang represent. They all sit down near the table, and finally Eru officially starts the meeting. She says that all of them will tell their theories one by one, while the rest of them decide whether it sounds likely or not. Eru starts first. She has created a bunch of notes and passes one sheet to everyone around. She begins speaking, and her theory is that 45 years ago, when the festival was happening, a bunch of punks must have infiltrated the festival, started harassing students, and even started taking money from the stalls that the students must have prepared. Then Siki, the president of the literature club, stepped up to their injustice and got the students' support, and with their help, he ended up pushing the punks out. While all of this commotion was going on, he must have punched one of the punks, which was seen by a teacher, and because he was violent, he was kicked out of the school. She finishes and eagerly awaits the judgment of her friends, who all tell her that they don't think this is very probable. There are two main reasons for that. First of all, punk culture came into prominence 40 years ago, whereas the event we are talking about dates back 45 years. Secondly, the school has strictly prohibited any kind of stall that takes money to provide some kind of service, as that makes the students very money-centric. Instead of creating art, they start creating money-making schemes. So if there are no stalls that have money, how will they infiltrate the festival to forcefully get money? Eru sits back down and says that their points make sense. Satoshi, the Riz King, plops down on the mat, asking if they can sit outside because his legs are falling asleep, and it is too beautiful of a weather to sit indoors. Eru tells them that they can sit by the veranda, which overlooks the pond, and both Ibara and Satoshi eagerly agree. They reposition themselves, and the next person, Ibara, starts speaking. She theorizes that 45 years ago, the school as a whole must have been fighting against the government, as they would be trying to gain control over the schools, so that they could force the propaganda on the young minds of students, so that they could create a loyal vote bank. This, however, must have failed when the school, including the teachers and the students, became one and started pushing back against their propaganda, which must have resulted in a bunch of strikes and protests. Among all this, Siki must be a true leader of these protests, and if he came to the attention of the government, they must have exercised their power to have him removed from the school. Hotaru and Satoshi both acknowledge the theory that she put forward, but also claim that there are some inconsistencies. Before that, however, Satoshi claims that he is really hungry, so Eru tells them to come inside the kitchen and discuss the theory, while she makes them some onigiris. Satoshi is obviously way too pleased to have handmade onigiri by Eru, which pisses Ibara off. They all sit down on the table, while Eru starts making beautiful onigiris, which they all eagerly eat. She is waifu material, but Ibara is still the best girl. Satoshi explains that his theory is also pretty much the same, but not quite. He explains his theory by distributing a bunch of pages that have newspaper articles and whatnot. He claims that 45 years ago, the power struggle wasn't between the government and the educational institutions, as the government was actually ruling with a peaceful regime in prosperous times. The main power struggle of that time was between the students and the teachers. They must have been pushing the students to focus more on studies, while trying to reduce the days of the festival, which must have led to a power struggle between the students and the teachers, in which Siki must have punched a teacher, which resulted in his departure from the college. He showed the newspaper clippings about the protests, but Hotaru claims that this can't be it, as the protests happened in June, but Siki was kicked out of the school in October. There is a long gap between now and then, so he cannot be kicked in relation to the protests. Even Satoshi sits down, claiming that he doesn't have any other bright ideas. They all now look towards Hotaru, who suddenly becomes very conscious as he hasn't really written anything new, as everything he wrote down was already discussed by the others. They all start pressuring him to speak, which gets to him, and he stands up asking for directions to the washroom. Iru tells him the directions and he takes off. On the way, he spots a room, which turns out to be Iru's room. He peeks inside to see that she has been working hard on piling up all these theories, which makes him feel bad for his lack of effort. He goes inside the washroom, decides that he will also start seriously putting in the effort, and starts racking his brain trying to come up with any kind of theory that might solve this mystery. Finally, after a couple of minutes have passed, he lands on a theory and comes outside of the washroom. He sits down and tells them that he might have landed upon something, and they all eagerly listen. He reveals that this mystery has a bunch of moving parts. First of all, we know that an incident happened in June, but then Siki left the school in October, so there are a bunch of months in between. Secondly, the incident happened inside of the high school, and we also know that there were two factions working against each other. Through the monthly newsletter, we get the information that the rival factions were the students and the teachers, and according to him, this was because the teachers were snatching away the decision-making power from the students and denying them something that they really wanted. Now, if you think carefully, there are very few things that all students could collectively want in their high school, and that is the school festival, which gives the students autonomy to express themselves and be creative enough by taking command of the situation and creating something new every year. That must have been the point of contention. We also know that earlier, the festivals used to be 5 days long, but now they are only 3 days long, which means that something happened at that time that led to this. His theory is that the teachers wanted to reduce the number of days the festival went on, but the students were not ready to budge. They organized a bunch of protests, and there must have been a lot of general discontent, but finally they got into an agreement with the teachers and were able to organize the festival as they wanted. Siki must have been one of the forerunners in these events, which would have led to him being in the limelight most of the time and getting noticed by the teachers. To prevent any other uprising from happening later down the line, the teaching body must have decided to get rid of him, but they couldn't kick him out immediately because he was considered the hero by the other students, and if they kicked him, there could be a lot of discourse sown by his removal, causing further problems. So they decided to bide their time and wait for a couple of months for things to settle down, and once everything blew over and got settled, they ended up kicking him out for unrelated reasons. He must have left like a hero, and that is why issue number 2 claimed him to be a legend when he left. He finally stopped talking and looked at everyone else, who were awed by his deduction. Iru smiled sadly and looked down, saying that now she finally knows what happened to her uncle, and both Ibara and Satoshi also claim that they have no objections to the story, as it seemed to be bulletproof. Iru, however, still seemed not to be very content with the result, and asked that if he left the school proudly like a legend, why did she cry when he told her about this when she was young? Hotaru, however, had no answers for this, and Iru quickly shook her head and thanked him for his help, as the mystery was finally solved. They get ready to leave, and Iru lends her umbrella to Hotaru, as it has already started raining. The absolute Riz King is obviously always prepared and has brought his own raincoat, and after saying their byes, both of them leave her house. While walking back to their homes, Satoshi starts talking about how, after a very long time, Hotaru seems to be invested in something and is actually putting active effort into it. Hotaru doesn't reply to that, but then Satoshi asks, "Was it because you like Iru?" He looks at him and says that there's nothing like that, and he is just tired of living a gray life and wants to start living his life with a bit more color in it. He tells Satoshi that when he looks at the three of them, he feels restless and wants to do something as well. Maybe he's just envious of their rosy lives compared to his gray ones. Satoshi doesn't know what to say, and they quietly get back on their bikes and start pedaling. He reaches back home and is in deep thought about the conversations he had today. He remembers back to the time when he first saw Iru and when he spent time with her, realizing that at those times the world wasn't gray for him anymore and everything got filled with color around him. It was warm and nice. He wonders whether life is the same for Seki as well, but before he can think much, he gets a phone call and rushes over to pick it up. The call is from her sister, who tells him that she has moved on to a new country now and is having a lot of fun here. She tells him about her misadventures till now and then asks what has been up with him. Hotaru replies that he has been actively working on creating the anthology and then tells her that he read Hyuka. This name immediately catches her attention and she says that Hyuka was one of her personal favorites and asks whether the tragedy of the kind-hearted hero Seki is still going around. This word grabs his attention as up till now, as far as he knew, Seki left the school as a legend and was happy with what he did, but the word tragedy wouldn't fit here. Hotaru quickly asks his sister to elaborate some more, but she says that she has to go and cuts the call. He goes back into his room and spreads out the papers again, realizing that the story he has and the theory he created are incomplete. There is definitely another part to it, as according to the story, he would have left the school with a laugh on his face and the love of every student and should have no regrets. But for it to be a tragedy, there is some important part missing. He thinks more and realizes that for most people, high school is the most intensely happy years of their lives when they get to live their rosy lives to the fullest. But for Seki, his rosy life was cut short abruptly, and he had to return to a gray life after leaving the school. Can a person like that be truly happy? He realizes that this is not a heroic tale that he thought it was, but instead, it is hiding something much darker beneath the rosy facade. The next day, he calls Ibara, Eru, and Satoshi to the club room for a meeting. He enters the club room to find them already seated, and when Ibara asks him why he has called them here today, he replies that there is a part of the story that still hasn't revealed itself and is shrouded in mystery. Eru looks at him with sparkling eyes and tells him that even she feels like something is missing from the story, and Hotaru tells her not to worry, as they will be able to fill in the gaps today and finally know the entire story. Ibara asks about the gaps he is talking about, and Satoshi asks him whether his theory is wrong. Hotaru replies that he doesn't think his story is wrong, but there are definitely some nuances that have pushed it in the wrong direction. He claims that they should investigate more into the foreword of Hyuka, which uses the word sacrifice. He claims that sacrifice can be used in a proud way, but also in a really sad way, and they have to figure out what the sacrifice here entails. Satoshi looks at him and tells him that it would be impossible to simply figure out in what sense the word here was written, and if they want to know for sure, they will have to find the original author. Hotaru looks at him and tells him that is exactly what they are going to do. Satoshi looks at him with surprise and asks him whether he knows who the author is. He tells them that he researched a little bit and found out the name of the author. He hands a paper over to Ibara and asks her whether the name rings any bells. Her eyes widen as she looks at him and says that the author of Hyuka is none other than the librarian. Satoshi asks whether he is sure that it is the librarian, as many people can have the same name, but he replies that he did the math and her age matches with the timeline, and when he asked around, he found out that she was 45 years old and she was also in the classic literature club. He then tells them to quickly get a move on as he has gotten an appointment from her to talk, and she should be ready soon. They all quickly gather their belongings, move outside of the room, and make their way to the library. They all enter the library to find the librarian still putting the books back in place. She smiles at them and tells them that she still has a bit of work left and whether it would be fine if they talked to her while she was working for the time being. Ibara quickly goes over and starts helping her with books while Hotaru brings up the foreword from Hyuka and asks her whether she was the one who wrote it. She looks at it and replies that she is indeed the one who wrote it, and then says that she believes that they are all here to ask about what happened 45 years ago. She asks them about their interest in the events that transpired half a century ago and why they would want to know about such a grim time. Eru replies that Seki was her uncle, and she wants to know about what happened to him all those years ago. She asks Eru whether Seki is doing well, to which she replies that he has gone missing in India, and there has been no word from him since 7 years ago. They all look at her and ask her to elaborate on the events that happened 45 years ago and tell them whether Hotaru's theory was correct. She looks at them and asks what theory they are talking about, to which they reply that he created a hypothesis about what could have happened leading to his expulsion. She gets interested and tells them all to meet her in her office. Once settled down, she takes the notes that Hotaru created and reads through them carefully. She asks him, in a surprised tone, whether he created this entire theory only on the basis of the anthology, and tells him that it feels like he was there when it all happened. It is borderline perfect. Hotaru, however, tells her that he believes some part of the theory is incomplete, and he would like to know whether Seki took the expulsion on behalf of all students, and if the school did so willingly, or is there something more to all this? She looks down sadly and tells him that he is right and that a part of the story is missing. She recalls the incident when she was way younger and has just recently joined the high school. School festivals used to be a huge deal back then, and the entire city would be brimming with students who wanted to attend or take part in any of the festivities. The atmosphere used to be electric, and the school festival was basically one of the most important things for any of the students in that era. According to her, however, the year that she enrolled in high school, the school festival went a little too far, and there were some clashes between the students, resulting in the principal dropping a bombshell on the students and deciding that the school festival should be cut down from 5 days to 2 days, with a lot of restrictions enforced upon the students. The whole school went into an uproar. There were rallies and banners, to the point where it became an entire movement, where the students tried muscling their way through the school and trying to enforce their will on the principal. This movement needed a face that people could rally behind, but it was ensured that the leader of the movement would be heavily reprimanded once all of this was over. The actual person who led the movement ended up hiding his identity, which more or less forced Siki to take credit for the movement and to take the fall. According to her, Siki was a quiet individual who hated any kind of conflict, so he wasn't really able to fight back. The protests became bigger and bigger, to a point where the teacher body was forced to reinstate the 5-day festival, instead of making it a 2-day ordeal. That night, the students burned their banners and posters in a huge bonfire inside the school grounds to celebrate, but it got out of control quickly, and one of the old school buildings was burned to the ground. It took the firefighters the entire night to extinguish the fire. The next day, the teachers needed someone to make an example of, and what better person than the face of the movement. They ended up expelling Seki from the school, and not a single student came up for his defense. Everyone stayed quiet and let Seki be offered up as a sacrificial lamb. There was nothing heroic about it. They all watched one of their fellow mates be sacrificed in front of their eyes while he cried for help, but everyone turned a deaf ear to him. She looks at them and tells them that is the whole story and asks them whether they have any other questions. Iru gets up and asks about the name of the issue number 2, Hyuka. She replies that Hyuka was the name that was chosen by Seki himself, and that she has no idea why he chose that name. Suddenly, Hotaro ends up sighing. He looks down to the floor and asks them how they could not see what it meant. They all look at him in anticipation, wanting to know what it actually means. He replies that the word Hyuka is nothing but a silly word play. Everyone looks at him surprised, but slowly the librarian gets it, and even Ebara and Satoshi seem to realize what it was, but Iru seems just as clueless as before. She asks him what exactly he means, and Hotaro explains it to her in clear terms and writes it down on a piece of paper, which she reads and her eyes well up with tears. Hyuka, when directly translated to English, means ice cream. He intentionally named the issue Hyuka because he wanted to hide his true feelings about the entire ordeal in the book. He wrote Hyuka to be a wordplay on ice cream, as what he actually wanted to say was ice cream. He wanted to scream that it wasn't him who was leading the protest. He wanted to scream that he was innocent. He wanted to scream at the other students for not helping him. She tells him that now she remembers why she started crying. She was crying because he told her that sometimes your friends will turn their backs on you. Even when you cry for help, they will just watch you being eaten alive, and all you can do is scream. The thought of being eaten alive scared her to the core, and she started crying because of it. She then looks at Hotaro and thanks him for solving this mystery for her, as now she can finally let her uncle go and be at peace with herself. The next day, they all met in the club room again, and this time Ibara also created a rough draft of the anthology. She presents it to Iru, who really likes it, and hands it over to Hotaro, who looks through it and complains about him having to write the entire main portion of the story. Ibara looks at him mischievously and replies that he was the one who solved the entire mystery, so it's only normal for him to write the main part of the story as well as his trophy. Iru, like the waifu she is, tells Hotaro that if he doesn't want to write it down, she can do it for him, and obviously he jumps at the opportunity, but she is stopped by Ibara, who tells her that he will write it himself. Hotaro looks at her annoyed, but ends up conceding, as she tells him to start working on the outline for the story immediately, as they don't have much time, and he tells her that he will. Later that day, Hotaro and Iru decide to walk back to home together, and while walking back, she tells him that she was surprised that he accepted the job of writing the anthology article. To that, he replies that he didn't agree to write, he was just forced to write by the others, and he was unable to weasel his way out of it. And he thought that he would dedicate it to Seki as a tribute to him and the tragedy that happened to him. He suddenly looks at her and asks her why she agreed to take Satoshi and Ebara's help after she was so against revealing her backstory to other people. She looks down at the ground and replies that she only told them about her past because she didn't want to forget that this mattered to her. She explains that she got told by her mother that soon, in a couple of years, these things will feel small to her, and she will laugh about the fact that she ever considered her uncle's words that made her cry to be so important. That made her think about her life and whether she should simply drop this entire ordeal, as it is of no matter to her. She later realized after talking to Hotaru that she wanted to remember this time, no matter how small it was. She still wanted to remember it with all her heart forever. The summer vacations have finally started, and Iru was finally able to convince Hotaru to come with them to the hot springs for a nice and refreshing vacation. They all got into a bus and started driving away from the bustling city life and more towards the calm and serene countryside. Hotaru, the friendless loser, obviously started getting carsick because he is not used to going out. After they deboard at a bus stop, he looks very sick and nauseous. Ebara tells him to hold on as she has cousins in this area and they have an inn, which they are graciously letting them stay in because of some maintenance going on, and they can't take any guests. They all wait for the van, which eventually comes, and they get inside. By the time they reach the inn, Hotaru is barely even able to walk out of the van. She introduces her two younger cousins to them as Rai, the older one, and Keo, the younger one. They exchange greetings and lead them to their rooms so they can freshen up a bit. Satoshi is as lively as ever and shows Hotaru the view on the outside, and indeed, even Hotaru comments that the view is incredibly beautiful. Before they can spend more time in the room, however, they are called by Ebara for dinner and go downstairs. They have dinner together, and after that, he goes back inside his room, but finds that Satoshi is missing. He realizes that Satoshi must have gone off to the hot springs and decides to simply lay around the room and watch TV. After a while, however, he is bored and decides that even he is going to have fun at the hot springs, as that is the reason he came here in the first place. He grabs his towels and moves out of his room, where he meets up with Eru. He asks her where she's going, and she also replies that she wants to take a bath in the hot springs. They start walking together, and she remarks that Ebara seems to be really happy here, and she's off to play with her sisters, which is why she isn't coming with her to take a bath. They go into their separate bathhouses, where Hotaru finally lowers himself inside the springs to relax and meets up with Satoshi. They have a bit of idle chit-chat, but suddenly, Hotaru starts feeling dizzy, and Satoshi is forced to quickly get him out and carry him back to his room. Both Ebara and Satoshi help lay down a mattress and then lay him down on it, covering him with a blanket so he can rest for a bit. After a while, Iru comes inside the room and asks him if he is okay. Hotaru quickly replies that he was fine and turns around to speak, at which point Iru gets up and tells him that they are all in the next room discussing ghost stories, so if he feels better later and wants to join, he's welcome to. Sometimes later, Hotaru overhears them exchanging stories, and since he has nothing better to do, he starts listening to them. He overhears Ri tell them a legend of old, which says that a long time ago, a troubled man came to this inn and ended up taking room number 7 in the other building as his own. He paid for it in advance and he used to stay there all the time. He wouldn't come for lunches or dinners, and he told all of the staff to stay away from his room and not disturb him. One night, the people staying at the inn overheard a loud scream. They ran towards it to find a woman on her knees, horrified to see the man living in room number 7, dangling on the edge of the rope inside his room. It turns out that he took a lot of money from a company, and when his business failed and he had no way of paying them back, he decided to take his own life. Ri continues that ever since that incident, anyone who stays inside that room ends up seeing the silhouette of a dead man hanging from the ceiling, and once a man who was staying there suddenly got sick and died on the spot. When this got out of hand, the elder of their family was called, who called an exorcist and ended up performing rituals for the evil spirit to ascend to heaven, and a new building was created right in front of it. Now no one goes there, and that building has been left abandoned. Hotaru gets up and looks outside the window at the room that the man died in and decides to close the windows because he is feeling chills. Suddenly, however, he spots a small shadow running outside of the inn, but doesn't think too much of it and goes back to sleep. He wakes up the next day to the most beautiful sight imaginable, but he doesn't appreciate true beauty, so he simply freshens up and walks downstairs to have breakfast, but is shocked to see Ebara stuck to Iru looking horrified. Hotaru asks what happened, to which she replies that last night after midnight she woke up because of a gust of wind, and when she turned around to close the window, she saw the silhouette of a man hanging from the ceiling in room number 7. They all sit down for breakfast, and Ri makes fun of Ebara, saying that she must have imagined it, as they were all talking about scary stories, but she replies that she is very sure that she saw it with her own eyes. Maya seems to be very uncomfortable with this situation and tells Rai that their father told her not to tell this story to anyone. She, however, pays no attention to it. Iru inches over towards Hotaru and asks him what he thinks about the situation. Hotaru replies that he believes that Ibara must have imagined everything, but then Iru reveals that she couldn't have imagined it because even she saw the silhouette hanging from the ceiling. Hotaru looks at her confused, so she tells him that when Ibara got scared by what she saw, she ended up waking her up, and when she looked at the window, even she saw it. Hotaru still looks unimpressed and claims that even she must have mistook it for something else. This enrages Ibara, who asks him to tell her what she saw in that window, if that wasn't the silhouette of a hanging man. This obviously makes Iru very curious, and she ends up forcing him to help her get to the bottom of this. They both go back to Hotaro's room, where he asks her several questions about what she saw. They decide to go and have a look inside room number 7, and they ask Maya to lead them there. As soon as she hears that they want to go to room number 7, she grows very uncomfortable and tells them that she cannot take them there before running away. They then go downstairs below the window, and Hotaro realizes that it must have rained last night, but before they can investigate it further, Maya appears from behind and tells them that it is lunchtime. They go back to the dining area and have lunch, and after they finish, reappears clad in a kimono, which she seems to really like. Satoshi takes him to the side and tells him that Maya seems to really like the kimono, but Ri doesn't let her try it on. Hotaro replies that he doesn't really care about that stuff, when suddenly he senses that someone is looking from behind. He immediately turns around but finds no one at the door. He doesn't seem to have any idea what could have happened, so he decides to go to the hot springs alongside Iru. Once inside the water, he meets up with Satoshi again, who casually tells him that yesterday the drums were banging late into the night, and that he was surprised that Hotaro slept through that. Hotaro immediately looks around and asks whether yesterday was the day for summer festival in this area, and he replies yes. Finally, he seemed to have put the pieces together. He walks back with Iru and explains to her that what she saw yesterday wasn't a dead man hanging, but the silhouette of a drying kimono. She seems surprised, but he elaborates that because Ri doesn't let Maya touch her things, Maya took her kimono without asking Rai, and went to the festival last night. The shadow that he saw last night was her running outside of the inn. It turns out, however, that her luck isn't very good, and it started raining, forcing her to come back. Now that the kimono was totally soaked, she was troubled, as Maya is bound to notice it early next morning. So she went inside room number 7, knowing that no one comes there, and hung the kimono to dry. That is what both Iru and Ibara saw and got scared of. It made perfect sense now, and again, Iru was surprised by Hotaro's deductive abilities. She said that it was a pity that Maya had to do that just to wear a kimono, but she sees them off in the distance, helping each other out. She runs towards them in the sunset, happy that they at least help each other out as all siblings do, while Hotaro walks slowly, dreading the mysteries that the future might throw at him.